Hello, and welcome to the NCOH monthly webinar. I think we have a slight issue with how the view is configured at the moment, but I'm sure behind the screens they're working hard to figure that out. But my name is Martin Hoek. I'm the communication manager of NCOH and your host for today. This meeting will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. You can also watch the previous NCOH webinars there. We have two guests for today, and they are going to tell us more about rabies. We'll start with two short presentations, as usual, followed by a 30-minute plenary discussion. You can ask your questions using the chat function, so please ask us questions. You can do so as we start, during the presentations and during the plenary session. We'll make sure we take notes and answer them. Our first speaker of today is Dr. Katinka de Belog. She studied veterinary medicine in Berlin and in Munich and obtained her doctorate in tropical parasitology and specialized in tropical animal production and veterinary public health. It's a whole mouthful, Katinka. She worked at the Rotterdam Zoo, which sounds very exciting to me, until she moved to Africa, where she worked for a total of 9 years as district veterinary officer in Zambia and Mozambique. Here she conducted dog ecology studies and organized large-scale rabies vaccination campaigns involving veterinary students. She also worked on rabies at the World Health Organization and since 2002 worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome in various functions, including some very far abroad. You can tell us more about that. It says in Rome and in the regional office in Asia. Apologies, and Bangkok. Currently, Katinka is chairing a working group for the United Nations against rabies. I am making a mess of this. I'm really sorry. Yes, sorry.
No worry, it's United Against Rabies.
Yes, currently, Katinka is chairing a work group of the United Nations Against Rabies Forum. I'm sorry, the sentence just doesn't work.
No, it's the United Against Rabies Forum. Correct.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, Katinka, I think I'll leave the floor better to you. So please start with the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction. And good afternoon or good morning to all those that are participating today. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about my favorite topic, that is actually, how can we deal and how can we control and eliminate dog-transmitted human rabies? Just even this morning when I was taking my Italian lesson and, trying to explain my Italian teacher what I was planning for today. And when I mentioned I was going to give this presentation about rabies, he said, "Oh, rabies, does it still exist?" But, rabies unfortunately still exists in about 150 countries in the world. And I would like to start, as I think most of the audience is European, but that the disease has been around for a long time, already the 4th century before Christ. There are also Greek and Roman authors that already mention rabies or similar conditions where dogs become mad or rabid. And Rabies, the word also comes from these languages already. And we can see that rabies is still the most lethal disease because once people start developing symptoms, death is the verdict. So there will be, there only have been very experimental research done on treatments and possibly Corinne will tell us more about that. But most of Europe, unfortunately now, are mostly free of rabies, but they have been infected since the Middle Ages. And you find a wide variety of animals. And it was really Louis Pasteur who was the one who first developed the rabies vaccine for animals, but also then for humans. And that made a big difference. So if we look at the elimination of rabies from Europe, we still see that there were numerous cases and they flared up during the world wars. And especially if we think that in urban areas, it was mostly dog rabies, while in the rural areas, it were foxes and also affecting livestock and especially cattle. But since the 1950s, Europe engaged in massive dog vaccination. And here we see again that if we eliminate the disease in dogs, we also protect humans. And this is the way also that at international level, we are nowadays working towards the elimination of dog-mediated human rabies. But Europe was very successful. So after the elimination of dog rabies in the late 70s, the country started with the oral vaccination of foxes. And by the year 2000, most of Western Europe is free of dog and fox rabies. And also vaccination campaigns of foxes have started in Eastern Europe and the Balkans and are currently continuing. And partly these ones are funded by the European Commission. So the development of the oral rabies vaccine for foxes was really a game changer. And well, I will not go too much into the transmission of rabies, but as you know, the virus is transmitted normally through bites, so lesions, and from there it travels to the nerves, finally in the brain, and this is where also most of the symptoms appear. And then death follows. And the animals excrete the virus via the saliva. So that's why changing the behavior of the animals, they are able to bite and transmit the virus. So really, as I mentioned before, the game changers have been, first of all, the development of the vaccine, but then of quality vaccine. Nowadays, we have very good vaccines available, and especially the dog vaccine is at a very low price. Then we have post-exposure prophylaxis for humans that has been developed, and the nerve tissue vaccines, where some people might remember, they're associated with the 13 injections around the navel. Fortunately, that is past time. So now the modern post-exposure prophylaxis vaccines are very effective and very few side effects or no side effects. Then the legislation that was introduced. Nowadays, if you want to travel with your dog, you have to have it vaccinated. So rabies vaccination is one of the legal requirements. And also some countries require lengthy quarantine of the animals, that, especially dogs that are being imported. And also in most of Europe, you have the registration of dogs. So in that way, you also know very well, the number of animals that are there in case of any outbreaks, the number that need to be vaccinated. I also want to mention the regional strategies, because we know that rabies travels around across borders. It's often, follows people or travels with people. And here, this regional strategy, also if we talk about other regions like Africa or Asia or Latin America, are absolutely key. Then responsible dog ownership. So to have a good coverage of dogs that are vaccinated, we need people to bring these dogs either to the vets regularly or to the free vaccination campaigns that are organized in many developing countries. But this all is not possible without, long-term commitment and funding. So to illustrate very roughly, and Martin, when I showed him this slide, he asked, is it only Dobermans? No. Dogs are, in most parts of the world, are the ones transmitting the disease. But we also have bats and bats in different regions. And we will also talk about this a little bit more in the second presentation. But it's mainly, in most parts, it's dogs that are transmitting rabies, and this is mostly in the developing world. In Latin America, we have also the vampire bats, or the Desmodus rotundus, which is a blood-sucking bat, and here rabies, it will be very difficult to ever eliminate rabies in the bat population. So just to illustrate this slide, this is still the bat rabies cases that have been reported up to 1998. So just as a reminder that rabies has not completely disappeared. And only last week, there was a case in the US where somebody died of rabies who had been infected through contact with a bat, but didn't go for post-exposure prophylaxis. So now going back at the global level, still, as I mentioned, the rabies situation, there were still 150 countries infected or where the disease is present. But we estimate that there are up to 60,000 people that still die every year of rabies, of this 100% preventable disease. And this clearly is completely unacceptable. So we see also that rabies mostly affects the poor and rural communities. These are the ones that where often do not have access to medical services or to the medical clinics where they go. There is no post-exposure prophylaxis available. And these are also the communities that often lack the information what to do after a dog bite. For example, the simple intervention of washing with plenty of water and soap the wound, the bite wound, is already a good way of preventing the virus from further entering the body. So we find that the highest number of rabies cases in humans are still in Africa and in Asia, and that dogs are the main source here. So in this infographic, it's just a kind of a summary, but we see that around, still every 15 minutes, somebody dies of rabies somewhere in the world, and that 99% of them are transmitted by dog bites. So if there wouldn't be any bites, there would also be no rabies. So also concentrating on this human-dog bond and improving, the treatment of dogs in many places of the world where the dogs are very aggressive, and also children often throw stones at them. So then, you get much more risk of dog bites, and here also we need to address this very carefully, understanding first of all the human-dog bond. We see quite a bit of geographical and also social-cultural differences. For example, in Asia, we have the community dogs, and these are dogs that are normally given food as part of merit making, especially in Buddhist societies. But the people do not take responsibility for the animals. They do not owe the animals or see them as their property. So if an animal gets sick, often this animal will not get any specific treatment. So these kind of considerations we need to think about when we design our rabies intervention campaigns and also our public awareness campaigns. So in this map, the blue colors, this is still where we find dog-transmitted rabies. This slide is a little bit out of date because now, unfortunately, Malaysia has been infected in 2018. And we fortunately find that Latin America, most of the countries have done an excellent job in controlling rabies, and we only have a number of countries where there are still some cases. Actually, I want to mention here that Mexico last year announced as the country that is officially free of dog-transmitted human rabies. So this has been a huge progress made. So the Pan American Health Organization has been very active in leading this effort. And actually, since the 80s, 95% of the human cases have been declining. So we hardly find, fortunately, any human cases of rabies transmitted by dogs. And the efforts has been by the ministries of health actually funding the vaccination of dogs. And we find that every year about 45 to 50 million dogs are vaccinated across the Americas. So just to illustrate here, and on the right side, on the left side, you have the human cases. So these are different graphs. But we see that the red, which are the human cases, very quickly after the rise in dog cases, the rise in human cases follow. But the same as dog cases diminish, we also find less and less human cases. The green is unfortunately the cases transmitted by bats. And here we see some peaks, especially in areas like in Peru. There was a major outbreak among children of bat-transmitted rabies a couple of years ago. So here also to illustrate how Latin America has been able to really reduce rabies to a couple of smaller areas where the disease is still present. And therefore we are hoping to celebrate very soon the success of Latin America. A little bit shifting the scope, I take you now to Asia, and here also again, dogs are the main transmitters of the disease, but the issue of the very cultural, diverse societies in Asia also needs to target and to elaborate disease control strategies very much adapted to the local conditions. Unfortunately, we often see that there are other priorities, other zoonotic diseases, or especially for the veterinary services, other livestock diseases, where rabies is not always prioritized. In 2018, African swine fever broke out in China and since has spread all across Southeast Asia up to Papua New Guinea and also gradually moving westwards. And we see that with this, the priorities are shifting. The same with COVID-19. We have seen that vaccination campaigns that have been planned for dogs have not taken place. And often people do not dare to go to clinics to receive post-exposure prophylaxis, especially in times of COVID. In Asia, we see also the movement across borders. In some countries, especially Vietnam, China, the consumption of dogs has led to a trade, an illegal trade in dogs, and often here also the trade of rabies has been going with that. We talk nowadays, I think the term One Health resonates, and we talk a lot about this collaboration between different sectors. And just in this slide, I want to illustrate, some of the main activities that need to take place in the human health sector and in the animal health sector. For example, surveillance and lab capacities and the exchange of information needs to occur between both sectors. In Indonesia, a couple of years ago, the integrated bite case management was developed, in which, for example, if somebody reports a bite case to the clinic of a suspected rabies dog, there will be communication with the veterinary services in the same area to investigate at community level, if the dog can be traced, if it has died or killed, and to get samples for confirmation, as well as finding if other people have been bitten, so they can be taken to the clinic to receive post-exposure. So here we see the importance of this collaboration between the sectors. And again, to mention the importance of dog vaccination here as well, and public awareness and the involvement of municipalities and communities. But this all is not possible if there is a kind of legislative framework, as well as the political support and funding available. And to eliminate rabies, it's not enough to have a vaccination campaign 1 or 2 years in a row, but you need to have the long-term perspective, 5, 7, maybe 10 years or longer, depending on the conditions in the country. So, we have developed over the years what we call the stepwise approach towards rabies elimination. This is a tool where, because often countries, when they face, let's say, an incursion of the disease or a new outbreak, often they do not know where to start. And this approach has helped the countries to identify, in which stage they are of their rabies control, and what are the gaps, and what are, for example, the capacities that need to be further developed. So with this SARE, we have been very successful in assisting countries to develop also their national strategic plans. And at the global level, in 2018, the tripartite, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the World Health Organization, together with the Global Alliance for Rabies Control, we have developed this global strategic plan for the elimination of dog-mediated rabies, and we have target 2030. We know it's an ambitious target, but I think we can make a lot of progress, and we have seen by setting this target, it also has helped countries to kind of move forward and work towards a common goal. we have also developed this rationale for investment and to help to kind of also countries to make the case for the importance of investing into rabies. I see my time is running out, so I just want to mention here the United Against Rabies Forum, and I see that Martin had some problems. It's not only United Nations, but it's the contrary. It's trying to invite a large group of experts, of organizations from academia, from private sector, pharmaceutical companies, pet food industry, experts, governments, to be part of this United Against Rabies, where we have 3 working groups that are very active. The first one looking very much at the development of tools and technologies. And the second one, where I'm co-chairing, we try to develop strategies and provide support also to countries, to guide countries to develop their rabies control activities and plans. And then the third group is looking at advocacy and mobilization of resources at high level. And then, as I mentioned, the membership is largely open. And also, if in the audience here, you know, there may be some persons that really would engage in rabies, please feel free to contact me. So we have a webinar. There's a series of 3 webinars. The next one is on Monday, where the working group 2 will be presenting our activities, and you're all most invited. And then to finalize, my conclusions here is that rabies, unfortunately, is still a neglected disease. It's not being prioritized as it should be. And there's still so many avoidable human deaths. The data are often missing because people die in remote areas and they're never registered as having died of rabies. But there is continued endemicity, and some places we see the re-emergence or also the emergence of rabies, like for example in Bali in 2009, an island that had never been infected before, as well as Malaysia in 2018. The importance of intersectoral coordination, as I mentioned, as well as knowing the social cultural drivers and getting the political and community commitment, but also the need for dedicated resources. And just to finalize here again, to mention the problems we have faced with COVID-19, a very interesting article has come out recently from Deborah Nadal on this topic. And then the regional cooperation is a must. And we see that the United Against Rabies Forum and the 0 by 30 campaign is picking up momentum. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Katinka. Very interesting. And thank you for pointing out my ignorance in some issues. There's a couple of questions I have, or not I have, from the audience. And one is about the reservoir. I mean, it says that human rabies are mostly from dog bites and dogs, but how do the dogs get rabies, and what is the reservoir? Is it all bats, and can't we vaccinate the bats, or can we eliminate the source?
Well, I think there are 2 different, one thing is the bat rabies, which is clearly also virologically different. But then we see that the dog rabies is the most prevalent, and still the transmission is mostly among dogs. In Africa, we have seen that, for example, wildlife has been infected by dogs. Most likely the initial introduction of rabies, for example, in Southern Africa, has been through the dogs, and they have transmitted it to wildlife. What we find, for example, in the Serengeti in Tanzania, wildlife rabies is often, again here, the spillover from the dog rabies. So also a way of preventing further spread is by vaccinating, for example, the dogs of the Maasai that enter through the game parks. And clearly, if we look at humans, it's mostly the humans get infected through the dogs. So even in areas like, for example, the Arctic fox, or in Central Asia, we also have foxes and jackals that are able to transmit rabies. But still, we recommend to also target still the dog, because this is where people get in contact with. And most of the cases come from dogs. I hope I answered the question here.
Yeah, I think you did. My only question then is, how long can a dog survive with rabies for it to pass it on and for the rabies to remain in the dog population without killing off the whole population?
Well, we often see that a dog with rabies can also travel quite far, can travel 30 kilometers in a day, has been some studies has shown. So very rapidly, a dog can spread rabies, and on the way biting other dogs or other animals. And this has been shown, like, for example, in Bali, where the disease has spread very rapidly across the whole island in a very short time. So, and therefore having these efforts each time kind of trying to control a focus is kind of giving a band-aid. I think we need to have large scale strategies and campaigns to be able to really have a good vaccination coverage. And nowadays with COVID, everybody knows about herd immunity, which is really a veterinary term, no? So 70%, if you have 70% of your dog population vaccinated, you expect the virus not to be able to be transmissible anymore.
Yeah. Last question to you for now. What role do felines play in transmission of rabies to people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because actually we see an increase in the last years in cases from cats. So I don't know if there is something happening. In Asia, for example, I had the impression where dogs and cats live in very close harmony, especially, well, in Thailand. I've seen it in my environment. It's if in the Netherlands, if a dog sees a cat, they just run behind it. But in Asia, animals live together in an environment. And I was always amazed that dogs and cats normally don't chase each other. So maybe therefore also when there is a rabid dog, the cats are not so afraid of this dog and they might get bitten more easily, because often we see that normally cats run away. So therefore maybe they are less prone to get rabies. So it's more the behavior. But in Thailand, we have seen an increase in cat cases and humans also infected by cats.
It's interesting to hear that chasing a cat is cultural.
Yeah, I think it is, actually. Yeah. The same, the behavior of dogs in Buddhist countries is just amazing. It's very different than in other countries. So, it was very interesting studying the street dogs around where I lived in Bangkok.
Very interesting. There's a couple of more questions, but we're going to wait for the panel discussion with that one. Thank you, Katinka. We're now going to switch to our second speaker. And our second speaker of today is Dr. Corine Geurts van Kessel. She obtained her medical degree at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and she got her PhD at the Department of Virology and Pulmonary Medicine on the role of dendritic cells subsets in influenza virus immunity. After training as a clinical microbiologist at Erasmus Medical Center, she now works as a clinical virologist at the Department of Virus Science, also an Erasmus Medical Center, where she leads the Laboratory of Serology and Virus Culture and is a member of the WHO referenced laboratories of viral hemorrhagic fever, arboviruses, and SARS-CoV-2. As a clinical virologist, Corine performs expert consultations for patients of Erasmus MC and other hospitals within and outside the Netherlands. She has a specific interest in filling the knowledge gaps in disease kinetics and diagnostics of emerging zoonotic infections, such as COVID-19, Lassa fever, Zika, and of course, Rabies. Well, I think I nailed this one better than I did the intro of Katinka. So the floor is now all yours, Corine.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Oops, let me see if I can find the presentation. So, okay, so thank you, Maarten, for the introduction. And I think we also had a very nice introduction into the topic about the importance of, all the strategies which we are using to trying to get less death of rabies virus. In my talk, I would like to go a bit more into what actually is the pathogenesis of rabies, why is it so lethal, and why is there not a good immune response being mounted against the virus? So to start, I will talk a little bit about rabies virus. Rabies virus is a member of the genus of lyssaviruses, which is a group of viruses where containing all different kinds of lyssaviruses. And rabies virus itself is a bullet-shaped virus, single-stranded RNA, and it has 5 major proteins: the nucleoprotein, the phosphoprotein, the matrix, the glycoprotein, and the polymerase protein. When looking into this group of lyssaviruses, it's very important to realize that rabies virus is just one of the viruses which can actually cause rabies disease in humans. So other viruses which can cause this disease are, for example, Moccolavirus, Duvenhague, European bad lyssaviruses, and Australian bad lyssaviruses. And the name already gives a hint of where these viruses come from. So the classical rabies virus is often transmitted by dogs, as we just heard, but can also be transmitted by other carnivores, like foxes, actually every carnivore is able to transmit it. But bats, they might play a minor role, but can transmit the virus. And I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about transmission of rabies by bats, because as a clinician, we quite often get questions of people who were in touch with bats. Do they need post-exposure prophylaxis? What is the risk? And I think it's very good to know that there are, for me as a a human doctor, I was not too much aware of the huge variety of bat species, which are more than 1,400 in the whole world. And lyssaviruses have actually only been found in a few species worldwide. And when we focus a bit more into the Netherlands, there are 18 known bat species. And lyssavirus is endemic in only one of these species, the serotine bats, which we see depicted here. So already that's a very good question to ask if somebody has been in contact with a bat or has a small bat bite. It's good to inform about the kind of bat or if the bat has been found, or if there's any information about the bat who caused the bite. It's furthermore very good to know that if a dead bat or an ill bat is found in the Netherlands, approximately 20% will test positive for European bad lyssavirus type 1. And this bad lyssavirus has been reported to cause illness in humans, although it's very rare as well. When you look into a healthy colony of serotine bats, approximately 0.05% will test positive for EBLV1, which is a very low percentage, and which is a bit similar to when you would test, for example, a group of foxes or other animals. So it's quite low if the bat is not showing any signs of disease. Then I could think I already briefly mentioned it, but when an animal bites an individual, so let's say a dog bite, the rabies will enter the tissue, and it will enter as a next step the peripheral nerve endings, by which it will travel towards the spinal cord. It will replicate and infect spinal neurons, and finally it will infect the brain. Once the brain is affected, there is a further spread towards extra central nervous system sites. So this is actually the way rabies always travels, and it's very good to think a little bit about this first period when rabies enters the body. So when we think of infection, and we think again of the different animals which can transmit the virus, it's also good to think about the kind of bite that the animals give. So on the left side, we see those large mouth with large teeth, and we can imagine what kind of bite they give. It's a profound bite, really going deep into the skin. Whereas a small bat depicted on the right side usually gives very superficial bites. It's sometimes not even mentioned by people that they had a bat bite, or they do not recognize it as a bat bite. So you can also imagine that the virus is being deposited differently by these bites. On the left side, it will be deposited into the muscle, and on the right side, it will stay in the dermis. And Lineke Begeman wrote a very nice review about that. And here it's actually summarized. So I've shown on the left side, we see the tooth of for example, a dog, and on the right side, a bat. You see the difference in depth of how deep it will penetrate. And you can see that the teeth of a carnivore will enter the muscle. And we can imagine that as well the nerve endings in these different tissues will differ. So the nerve endings are depicted in this picture. And I will not go all the way through it, but I want to highlight that, for example, the somatic motor neuron endings, they do end in the muscle tissue, but we do not find these in the superficial dermis. So this means that the virus will have another port d'entrée. So they have another way of traveling into the nervous system. And this can very well also lead to different symptoms, different neurological symptoms. And that is indeed what happens. Different waves of entries seem to give different clinical disease. And why is that important? Well, I think it's important because bat-acquired human rabies patients have several signs which are much more common than in dog-mediated rabies signs. So bats-acquired rabies virus often gives more sensory nerve deficits, a hemisensory loss of vision. They more often have motor nerve deficits. They more often have tremors, and myoclonus, and cranial nerve abnormalities. Well, these are all quite clinical signs, but maybe you know the syndrome called Guillain-Barré, which is a post-infectious syndrome. Well, it can very well be misdiagnosed for bat-related rabies virus infection, because most of the clinicians still think of rabies as the disease mainly existing of agitation, hydrophobia, aerophobia, whereas you can see here that bat-transmitted rabies, less common, shows these kinds of signs. So it's really important to know that there are different ways of entry which can lead to different signs, and not to misdiagnose a patient, because that can actually lead to the wrong kind of treatment or not giving post-exposure prophylaxis. On the other side, once the patients have the signs, we do not think it's very useful to treat anymore, so then we're too late. Once a patient has clinical signs and there are signs of encephalitis, so that the patient is really in the end stage of the disease, the patient will unfortunately always die, and we see that the virus, it doesn't matter if it's a dog bite or a bat bite, that the brain is full of virus, as we can see on the right side, the right picture. So in dark brown, we can see the staining of rabies in the brain tissue, and you see that really the brain is full of rabies. And there will also be typical Negri bodies, which you see on the left side, where there are typical cytoplasmatic inclusions of the virus. So this is a post-mortem sign. What we also see, and that was quite interesting, is that when we look into post-mortem material of clinical rabies patients, we do not see any activation of the immune system. In contrast, we do not find very much neutralizing antibodies. We do not find a massive inflammation in the brain despite the presence of all of the virus. And we actually see a depletion of plasma cells in the spleen. So there's no activation going on, which really triggered us to see why this happens. We also see that there's actually a decreased proliferation of cells in the lymphoid tissue. And when we look further, there's actually a depletion of the lymphoid organs. And this kind of depletion in lymphoid tissue is, for example, seen in end-stage HIV infection, but it's strange to have it in actually a chronic infection, which rabies is, because it often takes a very long time. So why does this happen? That's something what we really want to know. And why is there not, in this first period of infection, when the virus enters the muscle cells or enters the skin, we we always see a massive attraction of macrophages, of dendritic cells, of innate cells. And why is there not much? Why does this not induce a functional immune response or an activated immune response? Well, that's something we are looking into. And one of the first steps we took is to look a bit further into macrophages. As I said, there is a massive influx of macrophages upon a dog bite or on any kind of bite. And well, we knew that macrophages, they express a receptor, which is the nicotine acetylcholine receptor. This receptor, actually, the interesting thing about it is that it resembles the receptor which is found on nerve endings. So we thought, well, it's quite interesting to look a bit further into this receptor, because if it is an important way that the rabies virus will enter the nerve endings, wouldn't it be a way as well that rabies can bind or infect macrophages? We found, as I showed in this previous slide, that it's not exactly the same receptor, because macrophages, which we see here in green, they express the alpha-7 acetylcholine receptor, whereas on the nerve endings we see an alpha-1 receptor. But still, it's quite the same. So we also know that when triggering this receptor on macrophages, there's an anti-inflammatory pathway which is being triggered. So that might not be the thing that you want, but we were interested to see what happens if you indeed infect or expose macrophages to rabies virus. And what we saw is that when exposing macrophages to high levels of rabies, indeed there was a decrease in TNF-alpha, which was actually similar to when you expose the macrophages with acetylcholine. And as well, this effect could be reversed when you specifically block this receptor, which we see in this third bar in the plot. So far, it was quite interesting to see that indeed macrophages have a receptor which can bind rabies virus, and binding this receptor already starts to decrease the response and skew it towards an anti-inflammatory response. So next question is, does rabies virus actually really polarize macrophages towards a specific phenotype, which could lead further towards this immune suppression? Well, we know that macrophages are generally in an M0 state, and exposure to cytokines can skew them towards the M1 phenotype, which is generally pro-inflammatory, or towards the M2 phenotype, which is anti-inflammatory. So again, we thought, let's start with in vitro cultures and see what happens if we expose human macrophages to rabies virus and compare it with exposure to cytokines, which will skew them specifically towards an M1 or an M2 phenotype. After the exposure, we harvested the cells and we did Illumina sequencing to be able to really characterize the cells. And what we saw is when I here show a component analysis in which I showed that 1,000 genes with the highest variation. And we then can see that in green, there is the M2 macrophage. In red, there's an M1 macrophage. And already in this plot, it's quite clear that the blue rabies virus exposed macrophages are a quite distinct phenotype. So they're quite different from the phenotypes that we know. And well, although it shows the high resemblance to M1 macrophages, we also saw that there were a few specific suppressive genes in this macrophage population that might play a role towards immune suppression or towards an immune suppressive pathway. The next steps, of course, will be to see what the effect is on specific T cell responses after the contact between macrophages and T cells and B cells, and also to confirm these findings in vivo models. When we have done all that, we really hope to make a final step and to see if there's a possibility to skew the immune system versus a pro-inflammatory state. And why do we think that's so important? Well, we hope that there will be a possibility to develop novel intervention strategies by skewing the immune system early on after infection towards the right direction. As we also already heard in the first talk, there is very good post-exposure prophylaxis available. The problem is that you need the money and you need the logistics for it. So if you have a severe bite, a so-called category 3 bite, you definitely need a vaccine and a rabies immunoglobulin as soon as possible. Here it's stated that it can be given up to 7 days, but we think that actually you want it as soon as possible. The problem is it's very expensive. The timing is very difficult when you're in rural Africa or somewhere in an area where you do not have easy access and do not have easy travel. And it definitely needs a well-regulated cold chain, which is very difficult as well. So we think that we really need an alternative treatment for these rabies immunoglobulins to save lives and to be able to treat people easily and accessible. So coming back to the title of the webinar, No Rabies in 2030, I think, and that's also what Katinka already mentioned in the discussion after her talk, elimination of rabies from the complete bat reservoir, it is not realistic probably that will be very difficult. What is possible and what is very important is the vaccination campaigns in carnivores and in humans, as very nicely shown by Katinka, and education about how to handle once you have been at risk, education about washing, but also education about the contact with bats. So how do you treat bats? If you work with bats, are you vaccinated properly? Do you keep your titers up to date? There's a lot of education which can already help the risk of developing human rabies. And then finally, we think that the development of low cost and accessible post-exposure prophylaxis will save lives around the world. We really hope to contribute to that. So that, I think that zero human deaths from rabies by 2030 should definitely be a goal. I want to thank you very much for your attendance, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the pictures you have here are much more pleasant than the bite pictures you showed earlier, with all the animals with their mouth wide open. Hey, in the beginning of your presentation, you showed us a map, and Holland was completely covered in red dots compared to other EU countries. Do we have more bats in Holland, or is the reporting bias?
Yeah, I think that plot was in Katinka's presentation, but I did see it as well. I think it's about the reporting, but maybe Katinka can join in there.
Well, actually, this is what has been reported to the Friedrich Loeffler Institute in Germany, which is the WHO and OIE collaborating center on rabies. So yes, certainly it's the reporting. I don't think that from especially vegetation or that there are more caves or I don't think that the Netherlands has more bats than other parts of Europe. No, I don't think so. I think it's a reporting issue here.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. I think now that you're reviewed, one more question for you as well. It's regarding the tablets that are left around to immunize dogs. Do other animals eat them, and what are the consequences of that? Or how does it work? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, you mean the baits with the oral vaccine? Yes. Yeah. Well, here, actually, we are working very hard, and some groups are working very hard on developing this dog rabies, oral dog rabies vaccine. And it's quite complicated. It's much more complicated than the foxes. And here, maybe also I would like to have Corinne's opinion. For example, it's important with the oral vaccine, which is a live vaccine, that the animal chews the capsule, so to have the virus sufficient time in the oral cavity, because apparently through the tonsils it needs to be absorbed to develop the immune response. The issue is with dogs, if you see dogs eating, they gulp and they don't chew. So you need like a 5-time higher doses of virus in the vaccine, and it's live vaccine. So the two challenges are there. One, the safety. You want to make sure that children or so wouldn't pick up these baits. So normally you only give them to the dogs when you see them And oral vaccine is always an add-on to parenteral vaccination through injection. So you will only do it for dogs that are difficult to handle. And then you would kind of feed it to them, but you would watch the animal eat it. And if not, you take it away from the environment. So you wouldn't want to leave these kind of oral baits.
Okay, I was under the impression that you would just distribute them in different areas.
No, and still we are kind of facing some constraints with the licensing thereof. So some countries are a bit hesitant to license these kind of vaccines, but Thailand is making incredible progress. They have been doing some trials with the vaccine, first with the bait to find the right bait, and then with the vaccine. Because here again, dogs in different countries have different tastes. My dogs always love spaghetti in Italy, but in Asia, they like to eat rice and other things. So clearly dogs have different preferences.
Again, a cultural issue.
Yeah? Yes.
Interesting. Corina, a question for you. I think you answered it, but maybe you can just say a little bit more about it. The question is the ongoing development research of alternative to PEP treatment. I mean,
yeah, so there are people working on synthesizing other ways of antibodies, because that's what you want, right? You early after the bite, you want to infuse the whole region of the bite with antibodies who will bind the virus and neutralize it, hopefully, before it will enter the nerve endings. So yes, there's work being done on these specific antibodies, but not in the way that you can really reverse the immune system based on cytokines, for example. But yes, there's definitely work going on. The thing is, will it be an affordable treatment that I mean, if you come with something else, I mean, the immunoglobulins, they work very good. And if they would be available for everybody, there would not be too much of a problem. But
but the cold chain and the expense means that, yeah. What is your expectations and how far away are we from an alternative treatment plan? Do you dare to say anything on that, or is it?
I do not know, but I think it's definitely worth looking into it to have it as a tool besides all the other strategies that we need to take. But again, complete elimination will be very difficult. So then, yeah, it would be good if you have an easy access additional tool. But I mean, it would be great if that would be there in 10 years or something like that, but it will take time, of course.
Yeah, maybe if I may come in there, I think, if we still see that so many populations have no access even to the most basic, even to the basic PEP, immunoglobulins, completely to forget about them. And I think in the chat there was this question about tourists, that tourists get immunoglobulins. And yes, there is an overall shortage of immunoglobulins worldwide at the moment. So clearly to decide where these immunoglobulins go. For example, just 2 weeks ago, Burkina Faso, there were a number of bite cases from a positive rabies dog, and there was no PEP available in the country. So people were desperately looking for it, and they were asking, if international organizations could assist. And in the end, they found somewhere still a couple of PEP vaccinations available. But that's the tragedy of every day. In Sierra Leone, a family, 3 kids, 2 have been bitten. They only have money for 1, and if people need to make these kind of decisions, this is completely unacceptable.
Indeed. And can you tell us more about the incursion that happened in Malaysia? You said it was free of rabies, and how did it enter the country? Was it illegal trade? Was it?
No, actually, the first incursion was 2017. It came from Thailand. But Malaysia managed to control it through vaccination, and they created like a buffer, a kind of immune belt, as they call it. But then the problem is in Sarawak in 2018, it came from Kalimantan, which is Indonesia. So Indonesia, rabies is endemic. And apparently what we managed to trace back is that at the border area in the last years, there were a lot of palm oil plantations. And this led to a lot of people searching jobs. So people from Indonesia moved into the border area in Malaysia to find work. And often they brought with them the dogs. And, you know, these border crossings, there are green crossings. There is no border control. So in that way, most likely the disease was introduced. And also there are traditionally tribes that give puppies as presents. So there is a lot of cross-border movement there. So most likely that way. And we have been trying to get Indonesia and Malaysia around the table to discuss the issue, but Malaysia still is battling. They haven't been able to get it under control. And that's something we try to message to countries. You know, once the disease is there, it's not easy to eliminate it again. So if you're free, do everything to keep it out.
And, yeah, I think that's what they're facing in South Africa now as well. It was quite well under control in a large part, but now because of the political unrest and then there's a lack of vaccination campaigns, perhaps due to COVID as well, and now it's really getting worse and worse with people explaining about hundreds of dogs in the city which have been infected. So it's really like Katinka tells, it can explode at once, and that's of course really an issue, I think, once you're there.
Yeah, and if we think, for example, well, in the Netherlands, dogs are not vaccinated regularly anymore. It's only if you travel, then you need to have your dog vaccinated. Okay, in the Netherlands, there are not a lot of free roaming dogs, but imagine in a place where you have a lot of free roaming dogs that are not vaccinated. If there a rabies dog comes in, you know, the disease will spread very rapidly.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound very good. I have a remark by Wim van der Poel, noting that biting incidents in the Netherlands should be reported to the NVVA, and bats can be tested for rabies in Wageningen. Post-exposure prophylaxis can be executed based on the test results of the bat. Thank you for that, Wim. Then I have a question from Jaap Wagenaar, is regarding the One Health problems. Is that usually is a battle between the different ministries, and who is going to pay for it and who's going to take responsibility for it? Do you know more about that, Corine? Who is funding the research and your part, or do you have any experience in that?
Well, I think that's also already highlighted, I think, in the beginning of the webinar, is that it's quite difficult to get funding because it's obviously a neglected disease. So in the Netherlands, it's quite ironic because it's the disease where the most of the questions at LCI, so the national point for questions about infectious disease, let's say. So they're most often consulted about rabies because people are afraid if they were traveled abroad and they have had a contact with a cat or a dog or a bat. So it's somewhere it triggers people. But on the other hand, it's thought as a disease from far away, and we shouldn't care perhaps too much about it. So I'm happy with every funding that we get for the more fundamental research questions. And I think now we see that diseases can re-emerge, and that it's the oldest infectious disease we know, but it still hasn't been taken care of. So I think it definitely deserves funding, but it's hard to get because of the fact that it's not the actual cases of the actual number of human cases in the Netherlands is not very high. So then it appears to be something far away.
Yeah. Rabies is the oldest infectious disease we know. Is that the case?
Well, one of them.
One of them, yeah, definitely. Yeah,
because there's ancient documentation, or
yes, yeah, exactly. In very Babylonic scriptures and in Greek and Roman scriptures, you find mentioning that, you know, animals that behave strangely and that bite people. So there are descriptions of the disease and also people becoming mad. So often it's also difficult maybe because it depends on the incubation time. Therefore also in African countries, often it's kind of brought together with witchcraft, that people after some time suddenly develop and act strangely. And so there's a lot of myth and misconceptions also around rabies in many parts of the world, and also in the past. In the Middle Ages, they would put people in cold water and then in boiling water as a kind of a treatment, and really terrible things sometimes. Yeah.
Yes. Ancient medicine wasn't always something to envy, let's put it that way. Do you have a final question for each other?
Final question. Well, yeah, Corine. I don't know to what extent you also deal with diagnostics. Do you think there could be kind of an early diagnostic tool, and especially a field tool? We see, for example, now with dogs, they're having these kind of pen-side tests, like the pregnancy test for dogs. They are kind of varied result, but for humans, is there any possibility, because I don't know, from saliva or so, to have like an early diagnosis?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and that's something what we would really like to have, because of course, that can target treatment, and that can also take away fear, and that would be very useful. I think now what we still recommend is to try and get the source, so get the animal who bit the individual. We're thinking of looking into the site of the bite. So, for example, in Bangladesh, we work with a center where there's really a lot of people coming every day, up to 100 people a day with bites from dogs in the slum areas. As you already told, it's specifically the washing that's very important, and you can imagine that taking some kind of sample from the site of the bite very early could be of diagnostic value, but we do not yet have an assay which could which could really target that, and you really need the right doing the right sampling then, and I think that will be quite difficult because it's already a wound area, and so I agree that that would be very valuable, but it's it's difficult. And in that regard, I also have a question for you regarding the politics, because I agree that it's so important to have the politics of a country, to face that they should face the problem and the issues, and they of course should invest. But the first thing is to be engaged. And how do you do that as with your organization? I understand it's into communication, but how should we act with the politics and the regulations about that?
Well, therefore, I mentioned the stepwise approach towards rabies elimination. So normally what we do in a country is first to organize a workshop where we get the different ministries together, often also for example, municipalities there where there is a high prevalence or incidence of rabies. So to bring them together with also the politician. And the best thing is I've learned when you write a speech for, the director of veterinary services or so, because often then, it's maybe the first time they really think about the disease, when they do the opening speech of the workshop. And we always give to them the report and the final outcomes of the workshop. And in that way, you create more awareness, first of all, about the disease, because often, ministers of agriculture are not aware that rabies is a problem, and not only affecting dogs, but also often livestock. And getting, surveillance systems in place that you get data, because if you have no data, it's also difficult to convince the politicians. So it's a long process, but I think we have found the entry points on how to discuss it with the government, because in the end, it's the government that needs to implement, but it's also the communities that need to demand that they want to have their dogs vaccinated. And they also need to take responsibility for their dogs. That's another issue that is often very difficult. But for example, in the Philippines, they have taken up rabies and information about rabies in the curricula of children. So the ministries of education, it's part of their curriculum. So in one go, you inform all the children in school about rabies. And that has been a big difference by introducing rabies as part of specific subjects. For example, biology or even math, how you calculate number of dogs or averages. So this kind of examples from one country, we try to take it to other countries.
Yeah, great.
Very good. Well, we're a bit over time. So Katinka and Corina, thank you very much for your time and your sharing your knowledge. It's really interesting, and I hope that many more people are now aware of rabies and the problems it poses to still many people in the world, really. I hope it never comes to the Holland, the Dutch dog population. I was also very interested to learn that there's a difference in culture in dogs across the world. And Corina, your research truly is very advanced. And I hope we'll soon get better treatment plans in place thanks to your work. So the next NCOH webinar will be on November the 4th, and the topic will be Halloween related. It's still a bit of a surprise what we're going to do, but it's definitely Halloween. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and our YouTube channel to stay up to date. And thank you all for dialing in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Maarten, Katinka, Corine. I still have 2 people in the room, but I cannot remove them. I'm not sure who, we don't even see any names.
Oh, okay.
So
Oops.
probably they've left already, but glitch in the system.
A glitch in the system. Okay. Can happen. Well, I can't think of Corinne, thanks again. Bedankt. Super.
Nou, bij jullie ook bedankt voor alle voorbereiding en alles.
Zeker,
en om hier te mogen zijn was echt toch een goede opportunity, zoals we zeggen.
Zeker.